The crimson drops guided him directly to the stone well. In his 37 years working this harsh frontier ranch, Tobias Hartwell had witnessed enough injured wildlife to distinguish between deer's blood and something altogether different. Yet when he traced those scarlet marks past the barn's edge, the sight that greeted him made his grip tighten on his Winchester. A wounded Native American brave collapsed against his well-stone foundation, pressing one palm frantically against a torn gash along his ribs, while the other stretched feebly toward the wooden water bucket dangling mere feet overhead. The warrior's chest rose and fell in ragged, agonized rhythms, his coal-black eyes cutting through the haze of suffering to follow Tobias's every motion with the wariness of prey expecting predators from all angles. In 1847, discovering an Indian on your land signified only one outcome: catastrophe. The variety that left men scalped before dawn or roasted alive inside their own cabins. Every rancher for 50 miles around would counsel Tobias identically: plant a lead ball in the savage's skull and enter him where none would locate the remains. Tobias lifted his rifle, his index finger floating above the trigger mechanism. The intelligent choice, the secure choice, the anticipated choice. Yet something within those obsidian eyes halted him completely. Beyond mere physical agony, he recognized something else entirely. The identical parching desperation he'd experienced during the terrible dry spell of 1844, when he'd endured 3 waterless days, believing death was imminent. The same fundamental human craving that surpassed complexion, dialect, or which faction of conflict claimed your birth. The brave attempted speech, his mouth split and bloodied, producing only the faintest whisper: water. Tobias dropped his weapon and grasped the bucket. His fellow settlers would brand him mad. His sibling back in civilization would declare frontier isolation had corrupted his judgment. Perhaps they'd prove correct. But kneeling beside this injured outsider, guiding the wooden rim between his lips and observing him drink like someone rescued from drowning, Tobias understood one absolute truth: he was about to transform both their destinies permanently. What Tobias couldn't foresee was that this bleeding warrior represented far more than merely another tribal member. The events that followed would draw more horsemen to his property than he'd witnessed throughout his entire existence. The Indian consumed water like someone deprived for countless days. 3 complete buckets before his shaking hands could maintain a steady grip. Tobias monitored each swallow, his thoughts racing with the consequences of his actions. In this territory, demonstrating compassion toward an Indian equaled endorsing your own execution. But his vitality gradually returned to the warrior's features. Tobias observed something that chilled his blood. The gash along the man's torso hadn't resulted from beast attacks or hunting mishaps. A bullet wound, recent, still weeping, and considering the trajectory plus powder residue surrounding the entry point, someone had fired at point-blank range. Very recent point-blank range, meaning whoever had inflicted this injury might continue pursuing him, might be following that identical blood trail leading directly to Tobias's ranch, might be approaching his land presently with loaded firearms and inquiries Tobias couldn't address. The Indian appeared to detect his alarm. Summoning considerable effort, he lifted one hand toward the distant horizon, then drew it across his throat in a slashing gesture. His communication was unmistakable. Peril approached swiftly. Tobias felt his pulse pounding against his chest. Every survival instinct demanded he remove this wounded stranger from his premises. Eliminate the proof. Act as though nothing had occurred. But the man could barely maintain an upright position, much less ambulate. Relocating him now would likely prove fatal. Abandoning him here resembled painting targets on both their spines. Then Tobias detected it, the sound that had preserved his life through 12 frontier years. Hoofbeats approaching, multiple mounts advancing rapidly and purposefully, heading straight for his ranch. The Indian heard them as well. His eyes expanded with unmistakable terror, and he struggled to press himself against the well, as though minimizing his presence might render him invisible. Blood immediately began flowing between his fingers where they covered his wound. Tobias seized the empty bucket and doused the blood trail as rapidly as possible, but insufficient time remained for thorough cleaning. The riders would arrive within minutes, perhaps less. He gazed down at the wounded warrior, this stranger who had stumbled into his existence and inverted it completely within a single afternoon. A man whose presence on his ranch could destroy them both, yet whose dark eyes contained something Tobias had never witnessed in an Indian previously: appreciation. Genuine human appreciation. The hoofbeats grew nearer, close enough to enumerate them. 5 horses, possibly 6, all maintaining a gallop, suggesting their visit wasn't social. Tobias reached his decision in that instant, knowing it might represent his final choice ever. He couldn't transport the wounded man, but concealment remained possible. The abandoned root cellar behind the barn, assuming they could reach it. But as he extended his hand to assist the Indian upright, the warrior grasped his wrist with unexpected strength and slowly shook his head. Then he performed something that made Tobias's flesh crawl. He smiled, not the grateful expression of someone being rescued, but the knowing smile of someone who understood precisely who was cresting that hill. The riders appeared over the ridge like storm clouds bearing lightning. 6 mounted men, dust clouds trailing behind them, rifles gleaming in the afternoon light. Tobias immediately recognized the lead rider, Marshal Dixon Webb, a man whose violent reputation preceded him into every settlement from here to Santa Fe. Webb represented the type of lawman who fired first and investigated later, particularly regarding Indian conflicts. The type who collected scalps as souvenirs and labeled it justice. The type who would incinerate a ranch and everyone within if he suspected them of sheltering fugitives. Tobias positioned himself before the well, his body concealing the Indian from view, attempting to appear like someone whose greatest concern involved repairing a damaged fence post. His mouth felt parched as desert sand. Webb reined his horse just 10 feet away, close enough for Tobias to observe the cold calculation in his pale blue eyes. The remaining 5 men dispersed in a semicircle, hands resting on their weapons. This wasn't a courtesy call. "Afternoon, Hartwell," Webb said, his voice carrying the lazy drawl of someone who knew he controlled the situation. "We're tracking a wounded Indian. Blood trail leads directly to your property." Tobias felt perspiration forming on his brow despite the cool evening air. "Haven't seen any Indians, Marshal. Been working the south fence all day." Webb's gaze swept across the ranch, absorbing every detail. The man overlooked nothing. That's what made him so dangerous. His attention lingered on the dark stains in the dirt near the well, and Tobias felt his stomach plummet. "Is that so?" Webb dismounted slowly, deliberately, "Because that certainly looks like blood to me. Fresh blood. And unless you've been slaughtering cattle beside your drinking water, I'd say someone's been here recently." Behind Tobias, hidden by the well's stone wall, the wounded Indian remained motionless, but Tobias could sense the tension emanating from him like heat from furnace. One sound, one movement, and they were both corpses. Webb stepped 3 paces closer, his hand now resting openly on his pistol. "You know what the penalty is for harboring Indian fugitives, don't you, Hartwell? It's identical to the penalty for treason. A rope around the neck until dead." The words suspended in the air like a death sentence. Tobias felt every muscle in his body coiled tight as a spring, prepared to fight or flee, knowing neither option would preserve him. Webb was too near now. Any sudden movement would reveal the Indian, and once that occurred, bullets would begin flying. Then something impossible happened. The wounded Indian spoke, not in English, but in his native language, a stream of words that flowed like music, clear and powerful despite his injuries. Words that made Marshal Webb freeze mid-stride, and color drained from his face like water from a broken vessel. Webb's hand dropped away from his pistol. His mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. When he finally discovered his voice, it emerged as barely more than a whisper. "Dear God, you're him." The other 5 riders immediately dismounted, their weapons forgotten. Their faces displayed the same mixture of shock and something resembling fear, but not the kind of fear men show when confronting an enemy. The kind of fear men show when they realize they've just committed a terrible, terrible error. Webb turned to Tobias, his face now pale as winter snow. "Do you have any idea who you've been helping?" Tobias stared at Marshal Webb's terrified expression, his mind spinning like a wagon while trapped in mud. In 12 years of frontier existence, he'd never witnessed the ruthless lawmen display fear of anything. Not outlaws, not wild beasts, not even the Apache war parties that had reduced 3 settlements to ashes just last summer. But now, Webb appeared like someone who had just encountered Spectre. The wounded Indian spoke again, this time in perfect English, his voice carrying an authority that seemed to fill the entire ranch. "Tell him who I am, Marshal. Tell him why you rode so hard to locate me." Webb's atoms apple-bobbed as he swallowed hard. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked like an adolescent's. "This is Ayanna, son of Chief Takakota of the Northern Apache. He's the one who negotiated the peace treaty with Fort Richardson last spring." Tobias felt the ground shift beneath his feet. The peace treaty. The same treaty that had ended 3 years of brutal warfare between the settlers and the Apache. The same treaty that had preserved hundreds of lives on both sides. The same treaty that had made it safe for families to settle in this territory without fear of midnight raids. And he'd been giving water to the man who'd made it all possible. But if Ayanna was a peacemaker, why was he fleeing from the law with a bullet in his side? "There was an ambush," Ayanna continued, his breathing still labored, but his voice growing stronger with each word. 3 days ago, a meeting with Colonel Morrison about expanding the treaty to include the Southern Territories. But Morrison had other plans. Webb's face went from pale to gray. "Colonel Morrison is dead, shot in the back during an Indian attack 3 days ago. You're wanted for his murder." "That's what they want you to believe," Ayanna said, pushing himself up straighter against the wall. "Morrison wasn't killed by Indians. He was killed by men wearing war paint, speaking just enough Apache to fool the witnesses. Men who knew exactly when and where we would meet." The implication struck Tobias like a physical blow. Someone had staged Morrison's murder to frame Ayanna. Someone who wanted the peace treaty destroyed. Someone who wanted the territory to burn again. "Who?" Webb asked, though his expression suggested he already suspected the answer. Ayanna's dark eyes hardened like flint. "The same men who've been selling guns to the renegade tribes. The same men who've been making a fortune off this war. The same men who sent you to hunt me down instead of looking for the real killers." Webb took a step backward, his hand moving unconsciously toward his weapon before stopping. "You're talking about treason, about corruption in the territorial government. Those are serious accusations. And they'll remain accusations until I can prove them," Ayanna replied. "Which is why they need me dead before I reach the Apache Council tomorrow. Why they put a bullet in me and left me for dead. Why they're counting on men like you to finish what they started." Tobias watched this exchange with growing dread. He'd thought he was just helping a wounded stranger. Instead, he'd stumbled into the middle of a conspiracy that could tear the entire territory apart. But what chilled him most was the realization that if Ayanna was telling the truth, then Marshal Webb hadn't come here to arrest a fugitive. He'd come here to commit murder. The silence stretched like a taut rope about to snap. Webb's 5 men shifted nervously in their saddles, hands hovering near weapons, eyes darting between their marshal and the wounded Apache who had just accused half the territorial government of murder and treason. Tobias could see the war happening behind Webb's eyes. The marshal was trapped between duty and truth, between orders and conscience. And men like Webb didn't handle moral dilemmas well. They usually solved them with bullets. Even if what you're saying is true, Webb said slowly, I have my orders. You're wanted for Morrison's murder. I'm supposed to bring you back dead or alive. Dead would be more convenient, Ayanna replied. His voice steady despite the pain etched across his face. Dead men can't testify. Dead men can't reveal who really benefits from another Indian war. One of Webb's men, a young deputy with nervous eyes, leaned forward in his saddle. Marshal, if he's telling the truth about the peace treaty. Shut up, Bradley, Webb snapped. But Tobias could see doubt creeping into the marshal's expression like cracks in a dam wall. That's when Ayanna played his final card, reaching into a leather pouch at his belt with trembling fingers. He pulled out a folded piece of paper stained with blood. This is why they tried to kill me. A letter from Colonel Morrison, written the night before he died. Webb stared at the letter like it might burst into flames. What does it say? It says Morrison discovered who's been supplying weapons to the renegade tribes. Names, dates, amounts. Enough evidence to hang a dozen men. Ayanna's eyes never left Webb's face, including evidence that someone in the territorial marshal's office has been taking bribes to look the other way. The words hit Webb like a physical blow. His face went through several shades of pale before settling on a sickly green. Behind him, his men exchanged nervous glances, suddenly very interested in examining their horses' manes. Tobias sensed his pulse thundering against his chest. He was observing something that could destroy them all. The instant when a crooked lawman grasped that his own head was destined for the executioner's block. You're fabricating lies, Webb declared, though his voice carried no certainty. Am I? Ayanna raised the letter. Morrison placed enough trust in me to deliver this the evening he perished. Instructed me to transport it to Fort Richardson should anything befall him. Called to protection. Webb advanced one step, his hand now clutching his revolver. Hand over that document so you can eliminate it. Ayanna declined with a head shake. I think not, Marshal, but I'll propose a bargain. Allow me to survive long enough to reach the Apache Council tomorrow, and I'll ensure your name remains unmentioned when this truth emerges. The proposition lingered in the atmosphere like smoke from discharged gunpowder. Tobias observed Webb calculating probabilities, measuring dangers, attempting to determine which decision would preserve his life longer. But what occurred next astonished everyone. Deputy Bradley dismounted and approached the well slowly, his hands elevated peacefully. Marshal, I've been contemplating something. Recall that rifle shipment that vanished 3 months past? The one we were informed was pilfered by Indians. Webb's expression darkened. What concerning it? I observed those identical rifles 2 weeks afterward in the possession of settlers traveling south. Bradley's youthful face flushed with either bravery or terror. Made me question who was truly stealing from whom. The confession fractured something within the group. Suddenly, other deputies were nodding, exchanging looks, recalling incidents that hadn't made sense previously. Tobias realized that Ayanna had just accomplished something extraordinary. Without discharging a weapon or elevating his voice, he turned Webb's own subordinates against him. But Webb wasn't the type of man who surrendered without resistance. And when trapped, perilous men performed perilous deeds. Webb's grip on his pistol tightened until his knuckles turned white. A cornered beast is always most lethal, and Tobias witnessed the precise moment when the marshal decided that bullets were simpler than truth. You're all imbeciles, Webb growled, his mask of courtesy finally falling away. You believe this savage's testimony means anything against mine? You think anyone will credit the word of a deceased Indian and a handful of betrayers. The deputies dispersed instinctively, hands moving toward their weapons. But Tobias detected the uncertainty in their expressions. Years of obeying commands battled against the growing realization that those commands might be erroneous. Ayanna struggled upright, using the stone well for support. Blood seeped between his fingers where he pressed them against his wound, but his voice remained firm. Truth doesn't care who speaks it, Marshal. It simply exists. The truth, Webb spat, is that you murdered a United States Army officer, and I'm going to claim the reward on your head. He drew his pistol in one fluid motion, the barrel swinging toward Ayanna. But before he could fire, Deputy Bradley stepped directly into trajectory, his own weapon raised. Stand down, Marshal. The words exploded like thunder across the ranch. For other deputies followed Bradley's example, their guns trained on their own commanding officer. Only one man remained faithful to Webb, a grizzled veteran named Hawkins who appeared as corrupt as his superior. You're committing an error, boys, Webb said, though perspiration now formed on his brow. An error that'll cost you your badges, perhaps your lives. Perhaps, Bradley replied, but I've committed enough errors following your commands. I won't commit any more. Tobias observed this confrontation with mounting apprehension. 6 armed men in his ranch yard, all aiming guns at each other, all convinced they were righteous. This was how territorial wars began. This was how good men perished for evil reasons. That's when Ayanna did something unexpected. He began to chant not in English, but in Apache, a low, haunting melody that seemed to emerge from the earth itself. The ancient words carried across the ranch like wind through canyon walls, speaking of honor and sacrifice, of brothers who stood united against darkness. The effect was immediate and striking. The deputies lowered their weapons slightly, not comprehending the words, but sensing their power. Even Webb seemed momentarily captivated by the sound. And while they listened transfixed, Ayanna was accomplishing something else entirely. He was summoning his people. The song was a signal, a message carried on the evening breeze to ears that knew how to interpret. Tobias realized this with a chill that ran down his spine like ice water. Ayanna wasn't merely chanting. He was calling forth. The melody concluded and silence descended over the ranch like a heavy blanket. But in that silence, Tobias heard something that made his blood freeze. Hoofbeats, distant but approaching. Many hoofbeats moving rapidly. Webb heard them as well. His face went pale as moonlight. How many? Ayanna smiled, despite his pain. Sufficient. The sound grew louder, multiplying until it resembled thunder rolling across the plains. Not 6 riders this time, not even a dozen. An entire Apache war party was riding toward Tobias's ranch, and they would arrive within minutes. Webb raised his pistol again, this time pointing it directly at Tobias's chest. You caused this. You helped him signal them. I gave a dying man water, Tobias replied, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. Same as I do for any creature suffering on my land. The hoofbeats were close enough now to feel in the ground beneath their feet. Close enough to count. Too many to count. And Webb finally understood what Ayanna had been planning all along. They came over the horizon like a vision from another realm. 50 Apache warriors on horseback moving in perfect formation, their war paint gleaming in the dying sunlight. But as they drew closer, Tobias realized something that defied everything he thought he knew about Indian war parties. They weren't coming for battle. At the head of the group rode an elderly chief whose presence commanded respect from 100 yards away. His gray hair was braided with eagle feathers, and despite his age, he sat his horse with the dignity of a man who had never bowed to anyone. Behind him rode warriors of every age, from seasoned fighters to young braves barely old enough to carry weapons. But their weapons remained sheathed. Webb's face cycled through confusion, fear, and desperate calculation. He still held his pistol trained on Tobias, but his hand shook like a man with fever. "This changes nothing. I still have my orders." "Your orders," came a new voice, "are no longer valid." Everyone turned to see Deputy Bradley holding up an official-looking document. "This came through this morning, Marshal, direct from the territorial governor. All pursuit of Ayanna is suspended pending investigation into Colonel Morrison's death." Webb's face went purple with rage. "You lying piece of—" "Check your own dispatch pouch," Bradley interrupted. "Unless you've been too busy collecting bounties to read your official mail." The Apache riders formed a wide circle around the ranch, not threatening, but unmistakably present. Their chief dismounted and walked slowly toward the well where his son waited. With each step, the old man's eyes never left Ayanna's face, searching for signs of serious injury. When father and son embraced, a collective sigh seemed to rise from the assembled warriors. Tobias found himself witnessing something sacred. The reunion of a leader with his people, a father with his child, a peace negotiator with those he'd sworn to protect. The chief spoke to his son in rapid Apache, his weathered hands checking the wound, his face grave with concern. Ayanna responded in the same language, but Tobias caught enough English mixed in to understand the essence, the truth, the conspiracy, the names of the real killers. When the conversation ended, the chief turned to face Webb with eyes like black diamonds. When he spoke, his English was perfect and precise. "Marshal Webb, my son tells me you came here to murder him." Webb's pistol wavered. "I came here to arrest a fugitive." "A fugitive from your own corruption," the chief replied. "A man whose only crime was discovering how you and your friends have been profiting from war between our peoples." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Webb's remaining ally, Hawkins, was slowly backing his horse away from the circle, clearly calculating his chances of escape. "You have no proof," Webb said, but his voice cracked on the words. The chief smiled, not warmly, but with the satisfaction of a man holding all the cards. "We have Morrison's letter. We have the testimony of the Real killers who confessed everything before they died trying to escape our justice. And we have something else." He gestured to one of his warriors, who rode forward carrying a leather satchel. From it, the warrior produced a stack of papers that made Webb's face go ashen. "Your correspondence with the gun runners," the chief continued. "Every payment, every shipment, every lie you told to cover your tracks. Morrison was more thorough than you knew." Webb's world collapsed in that moment. Tobias watched a corrupt man realize that all his schemes, all his violence, all his betrayals had been for nothing. The evidence was overwhelming, the witnesses reliable, the justice inevitable. But cornered animals were unpredictable. Webb swung his pistol toward the chief, desperation overriding common sense. "If I'm going down, I'm taking you with me." What happened next moved faster than thought. Ayanna threw himself between the gun and his father despite his wound. The pistol fired, and 50 Apache warriors reached for their weapons in perfect unison. But the shot went wild because Tobias Hartwell, a simple rancher who just wanted to help a thirsty man, had tackled Marshal Webb from behind, sending them both crashing to the ground in a tangle of dust and rage. The dust settled like a curtain falling on the final act of a play. Webb lay motionless beneath Tobias, his pistol thrown clear by the impact. Deputy Bradley and his men quickly secured both Webb and Hawkins, while the Apache warriors slowly lowered their weapons. But it was what happened next that would stay with Tobias for the rest of his life. The chief walked slowly to where Tobias sat, catching his breath in the dirt. The old man's weathered face showed no expression as he studied this white rancher who had risked everything for a stranger. Then, without warning, He placed both hands on Tobias's shoulders and spoke in Apache words that carried the weight of ceremony, of honor, of recognition. Ayanna translated, his voice thick with emotion. He says, you are now brother to our people. What you did today, showing mercy to an enemy, risking your life for truth, choosing courage over fear. These are the actions of a true warrior. Tobias felt something shift in his chest, like a door opening to let in light he'd never seen before. All his life, he'd been taught that Indians were savages, enemies, obstacles to civilization. But looking into the chief's ancient eyes, he saw only wisdom, dignity, and a kind of respect he'd never earned from his own people. The ceremony that followed was unlike anything Tobias had ever witnessed. The Apache warriors dismounted and formed a circle around him. One by one, they approached and touched his hand, not a handshake in the white man's fashion, but something deeper, a recognition of kinship that transcended skin color or culture. When the last warrior had paid his respects, the chief presented Tobias with a gift that took his breath away, a war lance decorated with eagle feathers and intricate beadwork, its shaft worn smooth by generations of hands. This belonged to my grandfather, the chief explained, and his grandfather before him. It has never been carried by anyone not born Apache, until today. As the sun set over the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the Apache prepared to depart. Ayanna's wound had been properly treated by the tribal medicine man, and though he was still weak, he would live to see the peace treaty expanded and the real conspirators brought to justice. Before mounting his horse, Ayanna clasped Tobias's hand one final time. You saved more than my life today, brother. You saved the peace between our peoples. I just gave a thirsty man some water, Tobias replied. Sometimes, Ayanna smiled. That's how the world changes. One cup of water at a time. 24 hours later, they were gone. But they left behind something precious. Proof that in a world full of hatred and fear, simple human decency could still work miracles. Webb and Hawkins were tried and convicted of treason, corruption, and conspiracy to commit murder. The gun-running operation was dismantled, and the peace treaty was not only renewed but expanded to include all the tribes of the territory. And Tobias Hartwell, a simple rancher who had shown mercy to a stranger, became the first white man in territorial history to be formally adopted into the Apache Nation. Because sometimes in the brutal landscape of the Old West, the greatest battles weren't won with guns or violence, but with something far more powerful: the courage to see enemies as human beings and the wisdom to choose compassion over fear.